The Dark Elves, the twisted and perverted residents of Nagaroth, are hellbent on brutally murdering their enemies, and they have plenty of tools to get that job done. However, they do have some hidden weaknesses of sorts, which can be a detriment to your Dark Elf army if you are unaware of them. All will be revealed in this guide, and we'll take a look at the strengths, weaknesses, roster and strategies of the Dark Elf army. This is all about using the army on the battlefield, and there will be nothing about the campaign.
You shall face the might of the Druki, and our ways of killing are far more inventive than your own.
So let's begin as always with the main strengths and weaknesses. These are useful things to remember when playing as or against the Dark Elves. So first off, it's no secret that the Dark Elves are a heavy damage dealing faction. Lots of melee attack, armor piercing and bonus versus infantry. They can dish out their damage pretty damn quickly. Now for weaknesses, the Dark Elves don't really have any major obvious ones like no cavalry or no ranged units, low leadership, so their weaknesses are more subtle. Overall, you'll find the Dark Elf army quite expensive, typically meaning that you won't be able to bring as many units as other factions, so you may get overrun and surrounded, something you have to be aware of. Now which section of the army is the strongest for the Dark Elves? Well, it's going to be their infantry. From executioners to shades to dark shards, melee or missile infantry, they're all pretty damn powerful, some being a combination of both. However, the downfall of many Dark Elf units is in their endurance, their ability to stay in a prolonged fight. Now it's not like the Skaven or Greenskins or Beastmen where they have low armor, low leadership and low melee defense which gives them problems, as some of these things are actually pretty good for the Dark Elves. So, what is it that makes the Dark Elves struggle? It's mainly in their health or hit points. They tend to have less than other faction unit equivalents, and some of their unit sizes are a little bit smaller than most as well. I'll go into this more later on. Despite all this though, the Dark Elf army are the masters of flanking. Many of their units are designed to play this role very well, with fast foot speeds and damage dealing capabilities. Now the last subtle weakness for the Dark Elves is the wasting of their murderous prowess ability, which gives the army some major boosts to their damage output, which could be the difference between victory and defeat. So all these things I believe to be the main strengths and weaknesses about the Dark Elf army. So get to know and understand these things so you can take advantage of them as the Dark Elves or exploit them when playing against the Dark Elves. Now let's take a look at the Dark Elves roster. I'll give a brief explanation of the unit and what I believe its role to be within the army. And first up on the scales we have Dreadlord, Sword and Crossbow, a well-rounded, fairly decent lord. Can get stuck into melee fights well enough, although he doesn't have armor piercing melee damage, but he does have armor piercing missiles, which are actually really damn useful. Mainly against those lords that hide up on flying mounts or just run around on land mounts so that you can't do any melee damage to them, like that dickhead Krokgar, or lords that you just don't want to get too close to, like Ungrim Ironfist. He can also add buffs to nearby ranged units. Dreadlord Sword and Shield is of course very similar to the first one, just more of a melee focus, with a silver shield as well. Again, a good choice if you want to save money, but do be careful when fighting those more advanced or legendary lords. They can both be put on mounts to further increase their speed or damage output. Morathi, otherwise known as Mummy to Malekith, is one of the lesser used lords for the Dark Elves, and honestly it's kind of with good reason. Her utter disregard for clothing means that she has no armor. This makes her incredibly vulnerable. She does have some life stealing abilities to help keep her in the game, but she doesn't have much health either, so really she should avoid melee combat. I'd advise putting her on a mount as it's not very expensive and will help keep her out of danger. She is armor piercing and anti-large, perhaps useful for swooping in and injuring enemy cavalries, as she does have a pretty nice charge bonus as well. But I think the biggest qualm with her is that for just a little bit more money you could get Malekith instead, and he's far better in melee and arguably has better spells as well. I think the only reason you would want to take her over him is if you wanted her particular spells. Speak of the devil, Malekith is one of the toughest legendary lords going. He plays a hybrid caster melee role very well, with great stats all across the board and a silver shield, although he doesn't have any armor piercing, so he may want to be careful against those heavily armored armor piercing lords. A wealth of strong magic from Bladewind to Soul Stealer also give him plenty of versatility. You can put him on some mounts to make him even more dangerous, but this will start to hike up his price tag. Being so expensive can be detrimental to your army size, which can be a problem against certain factions. So outside of the campaign, do try to choose your lord based on what you really need. The Khainite Assassin, quite obviously designed to murder high value targets. He can sneak up into melee with them with Stalk, and as he's a duelist and has poison attacks and has an ability that reduces their melee defense, he will get rid of people very quickly. His crossbow with massive missile damage as well can make him function like the crossbow lord, great for taking down those targets that refuse to stay still, albeit at quite a short range. A good choice to bring along if you're expecting some tough lords or heroes. The Death Hag, apparently a melee specialist, although you wouldn't think it to look at her armour and melee defence. A decent weapon strength, bonus versus infantry and poison attacks though means she can be great at taking on lower tier infantry. She can also cause rampage to enemy units and has a mount which can cause terror. She'll be useful to mix in with your front line in a supporting role and should avoid fighting other enemy characters. And then you have your various sorceresses. Is that a word? What's the plural for sorceress? Sorcerai? We'll go with sorceresses. You have the choice of shadow, fire or dark, all very offensive spellbooks generally with some buffs and debuffs in there. So of course you just want to bring whichever one you're going to find most useful for the fight. Which spellbook you like and which spells you find handy is entirely personal preference. Useful to bring along if you don't have a lord that has any spells. Rest assured though, they are your typical caster who is pretty dreadful in melee, of which they should try to avoid. Onto our infantry and the worryingly named Bleak Swords. They're actually not too bad despite their name. They're kind of similar to Empire Swordsmen with a bit more leadership, but of course less health, and a silver shield to block those missiles. An okay frontline unit choice, perhaps with a bit of upgrading they could be a bit more formidable and last a bit longer on that front line. Not bad for the price you pay, but don't expect anything special from them. They're going to be the closest thing you have to an expendable unit as well. Dread Spears, a more appropriate name for an evil faction unit I think. Pretty much your typical budget anti-large unit, with all the usual traits and a silver shield as well, so their role is going to be dealing with those large units, protecting your flanks. They could even pose as a front line, with their melee defense being quite high, but they do have to watch out for high melee attack units, who will probably chew through them pretty quick either way. But one thing to remember about a lot of these Dark Elf units is that yes, they do have higher leadership than similar units from other factions, but they do have less health, so it's going to balance out in their staying power. Now, Black Ark Corsairs. I'm going to say something a little bit controversial right now, and that is that Black Ark Corsairs are not, I repeat, not a frontline unit. Whoa, revelation. I'm going to go into this in detail a little bit later on, but for now just know that they don't have a lot of health, they don't have a shield, and they have a smaller unit size than the previous two units, so charging them head on into enemy front lines, tanking out missile damage in charges, is a good way to get them routed quickly. They either need a meat shield in front of them to absorb some of the damage, or to do what I believe they're primarily meant to do, which is flank. Because of their fast foot speed, it suggests they're meant to be a flanking unit. With a bonus versus infantry and no armor piercing damage, they're looking for those softer targets. And then to another strong flanking unit in the Witch Elves. Great leadership, great melee attack, great speed, a bonus versus infantry and some debuffs mean that they are fantastic against those lighter units. The Madness of Cain ability on their melee attack reduces enemy melee defense speed and can cause rampage, which means your opponent will lose control of that unit for a short period of time, just like the Lizard Men. Very useful for giving your enemy some bad matchups. But this also means that the Witch Elves can be pretty good mixed in with your front line, as they can apply those debuffs to the enemy front line. But I suppose they can do this flanking too. Of course though, their lack of armor means they're very vulnerable, so do be careful with them. Now to a top tier unit in your Harganeth Executioners. If you can't figure it out from their name, they're a very dangerous damage dealing unit. Armor piercing, bonus versus infantry, tons of armor, leadership, they're going to be the ones to deal with the enemy elite infantry. Now how are you going to deal with elite large units? Well, that's where the Blackguard of Nagarond come in. Great armor, great leadership, great melee defense of course, armor piercing, all this is going to help them take down those elite large units or any kind of large unit, but of course elite is what they should really be looking for if you've got some dread spears to deal with lesser things. Could be a great holding front line if you really wanted that, but you may find it a bit too expensive. Onto missiles, and Dark Shards are your first and cheapest option, and they're very much your typical missile unit. They've got average range but good damage, and it's armor piercing, which means they can do lots of damage to pretty much any kind of opponent, but as they don't have a shield, you want to bring them against factions that don't have a lot of ranged. If you are facing a good ranged faction, then Dark Shards with shields are going to be the better call. Basically exactly the same, just they have a silver shield so they can block some of those incoming missiles, giving them an advantage in missile skirmishes. The fact that they're a bow weapon as well means they can fire over your units or over parts of the map, which is something that similar armor piercing units can't do, like Thunderers or Handgunners. They'll probably want to prioritise those heavily armoured elite units, especially monsters, because they'll be great for taking them down as they're such a big target. Black Ark Corsairs with handbows, very much the same as the regular Black Ark Corsairs. They just do a little bit less melee damage, but can make up for it with that ranged attack of course. Going to be very useful flanking, shooting enemy front lines in the back before charging in. Good to try and make use of both aspects of their game, ranged and melee. No point using them as just one, because then you might as well just bring a skirmisher unit or just bring a melee unit, so a good unit to keep the enemy guessing. In a similar vein, we have our Shades. They are dual role, they can be missile units, they can be melee units. They excel at both. They've got a really strong armor piercing missile attack, as well as okay weapon damage with pretty good melee attack. They are lacking in the armor though, so you do need to be careful with them from missiles and from taking any charges. They of course make a fantastic ambushing unit as they have Stalk and Vanguard deployment, so you can pull some pretty crafty tricks with these boys. For just a little bit more money though, you can get a better unit in the dual weapons version. They have slightly more melee defense and, most notably, a bonus versus infantry, thus making them far better at killing anything without too much armor. Unless you're on a tight budget, you'll probably want to bring these when facing a lot of light infantry rather than the previous ones. If destroying heavily armoured units is more what you need, then the Shades with great swords are going to be your better choice, as they still have the bonus versus infantry but are armour piercing as well, so they can take on pretty much any kind of infantry. As all the Shades are ambushing units, they're great for providing a surprise attack and forcing the enemy to change his game plan to deal with them, as they simply can't be ignored. But of course that lack of armour can be their downfall if they try to fight other missile units or take any charges from monsters and cavalry. Primarily best off as a flanking unit. Onto cavalry with our Dark Riders, very much your typical light cav, although they have a slightly better charge bonus than similar units, so you really want to use them as a shock cavalry, charge them in, take them away. Their melee stats aren't fantastic, so they don't survive well in prolonged combat. As they're very fast on their feet, they're going to be great for assisting that hard flanking attack of the Dark Elves, getting after those enemy missile units or any routing units for those easy murderous prowess kills. For the price you pay, they'll do their job pretty well. And then there's the shielded variant, very much the same as the previous unit, just they have those shields, which is going to be better against factions with a lot of missiles. So as always, consider the faction you're facing and whether you need shields or not. They also have Vanguard deployment, so they can be a little bit sneaky and perhaps support Shades and flanking units as well. If you're looking to dominate the cavalry game though, Cold One Knights have got your name written all over them. They're heavily armoured, they've got a shield, they're armour piercing, and a pretty good charge bonus as well. Their main selling point though is that they are anti-large, so great for taking on other enemy cavalry or even some monsters. Do be wary though, as they are prone to rampage and you losing control of them. If destroying infantry is more your thing though, then Cold One Dread Knights are going to be the way to go. A ton of armour, a shield, decent melee attack and melee defense, armour piercing. These boys are designed to do a lot of damage and they can stay in prolonged combat as they're more of a melee cavalry than a shock cavalry. Got to be careful of those primal instincts again, but both these Cold One units cause fear as well, which makes these ones especially great for charging into the back of enemy front lines as they go through bone like batter. Onto a missile cav in Dark Riders with repeater crossbows. These guys are actually a dangerous missile cav for a change, as their missile attack is pretty strong and armour piercing, not to mention their range isn't too bad either, at least for an armour piercing missile cav. Gotta be a great distraction, great for drawing enemies out of position. They're a unit again that can't be ignored, because if the enemy doesn't make any attempt to stop them, they can rack up a considerable amount of damage. Another great ambushing and flanking unit. Like all Dark Riders though, they need to watch out for the missiles. The one and only Cold One Chariot for the Dark Elves. Use it like any other chariot, charge it through units and out the other side, keep it moving, don't let it stop, don't let it stay in prolonged combat, it doesn't have the melee defense for that. There's also low risk of rampage if you keep it moving as well. It also has a strong armour piercing missile attack with decent range, so you can just hover around the enemy backlines and flanks, popping off missiles, doing your damage, waiting for that perfect opportunity to swoop in with a charge and unleash that tasty charge bonus all over some unsuspecting unit's face. The Reaper Bolt Thrower, the only artillery for the Dark Elves. This probably doesn't need much explanation, I'm sure you probably know how to use artillery. It has two fire modes, one for infantry, one for large, it's armour piercing. Its range isn't bad, but it's not fantastic. Bring one along if you want a ranged advantage or to play quite defensively. Lastly, our monsters then, with Harpies being first up. Very much a good distraction and harassing unit. Great for occupying the missiles and artillery units of the enemy to stop them from firing on your incoming army. They will of course be a sacrifice for that greater good, but they can play that role pretty damn well with good high melee defense. However, a lack of armor means they could be focus fired down pretty quickly. A good choice to bring if you're expecting a lot of enemy artillery or missiles and you need to distract them. Onto a proper monster now with your War Hydra. Of course this thing is designed to charge into enemy infantry and eat it alive basically. Lots of armour piercing weapon strength, melee attack and even a little bit of a charge bonus as well. which actually kind of suggests that it may be better used like a shock cavalry because it has pretty bad melee defense as well. Don't forget that fiery breath attack, of course, for a little bit of a ranged option. Great for destroying all kinds of infantry apart from the anti-large units, of course. Steer clear of those. It'll also cause fear and terror, which is great for routing those late game units when they're all beaten down, and it has regeneration, which is always useful, although it comes with the weakness to fire, which regeneration has, although it breathes fire. And lastly, the almighty Black Dragon. He can actually play a very similar role to the War Hydra, just doing everything a little bit better, and of course, he can fly. He's got that breath attack, he's got decent armor, he's got decent melee attack, he's got decent melee defense, he's got weapons, he's got it all basically. He's got the terror, he can do everything the War Hydra can do, but he can do it better. Albeit for a bigger price tag, of course. If you want that air or just mobility superiority, then a Black Dragon may be a great way to go to destroy enemy infantry. So then, with all these Dark Elf units in tow, let's take a look at their tactics and strategies. And it should come as no surprise that aggression is one of the first things that will define the Dark Elves. They've got a lot of killing power and they need to use it quickly. Their lower health means they can't stick around as long as other factions, so they need to get that damage done. And it's not that they have to play as a rush faction necessarily, they have plenty of missiles and artillery to play a bit of a ranged game and a bit of a skirmish, but if they start taking any kind of artillery fire themselves, they're not really equipped to tank it out, so you need to get in there and try and do your damage as quick as possible to rack up that murderous prowess bar. Now the Dark Elves flank attack is one of the strongest in the game. You can wait till the enemy front line's engaged and you've got tons of units you can use to flank with. Witch Elves, Black Ark Corsairs, Shades, all fantastic flanking units. With their nifty foot speeds they can get behind that enemy line quick time. You've also got your repeater crossbows and your other Dark Riders that can harass that backline, harass those missiles, protect those flanking units, Harpies as well, your Chariot, your Black Dragon, all these can aid that brutal flanking attack of the Dark Elves, and they can just sweep across from one side. As long as they're protected on the way round, they don't get hammered down by missiles or tied up by anything else, they should be able to flank round no problem and just charge through everything. Now, I think there's a little bit of confusion around the Dark Elves front line. I see a lot of people online using Black Ark Corsairs as their front line, and I used to as well, because they do seem like they should be a great frontline unit. So I did a little test of some of the cheaper frontline options, Dread Spears, Bleak Swords and Black Ark Corsairs. They're facing 2 units of Empire Swordsmen each. I'm trying to see who will break first. And as we know from earlier, the Black Ark Corsairs don't have a great deal of health, and both the Bleak Swords and the Dread Spears have more health, bigger unit sizes and better melee defense than the Black Ark Corsairs. This ultimately makes them a better holding unit and of course better for your front line. Now in terms of damage, of course the Black Ark Corsairs will do the most if they stayed in the fight as long as the other 2 units, but chances are they won't. The Dread Spears are of course more of an anti-large unit, so they're not going to do so well against infantry compared to the Bleak Swords. You can see up top now the Black Ark Corsairs are wavering, shortly followed by the Bleak Swords, and there go the Dread Spears. So you can see not too much of a time difference in how long each of them lasted. This is by no means the most accurate and fair test in the world, but I think if you upgraded Dread Spears or Bleak Swords to the same price as Black Ark Corsairs, they'd do a fair amount better. So I advise you experiment with your front lines a bit more rather than just opting for the Black Ark Corsairs because they seem like they must be the best. I think if you want to use Black Ark Corsairs as any kind of front line, they need a meat shield to absorb charges for them at least. Fighting amongst better holding units may be good for them to help them last a bit longer as well, as they'll take less damage. So how can we help our important frontline and flanking units? Well, that's where distraction comes in. As the Dark Elves have some very fast and agile flanking units, they can provide a great distraction because they simply can't be ignored. So the main bulk of my army's moving up here. I've got some Witch Elves on the flank, I've got some Black Ark Corsairs behind my front line. I've got a War Hydra, he's going to be part of the distraction force, a bunch of Dark Riders, crossbow Dark Riders, Harpies. These all cannot be ignored because they will do a lot of damage. So I'm coming in for a heavy distraction sort of flank on the right hand side of this Empire army. They're all going to start looking this way with their missiles, with their spears, with their cavalry, whatever. This allows some of my more precious units to move up without being shot in the face by artillery and missiles. And you can see my Corsairs and Witch Elves have reached the battle with very little damage sustained. I can then begin my utter annihilation of this left hand side of the army and sweep through with my brutal flanking attack. This is all made possible with my distraction force. If they weren't there, the missiles would have been looking this way, they probably would have shot my Corsairs a bit, my Witch Elves, some cavalry may have come and charged into my Witch Elves, and they can't say that because they're not wearing any clothes. So that distraction force really helped out. They're just tying things up over here, got cavalry charging around, my War Hydra's in there, just causing problems, allowing that left side flanking attack plenty of time, plenty of room to make the most of its damage dealing power and to sweep through and get those kills for that murderous prowess. Which leads me on to my next point about murderous prowess. It's a beautiful thing when you see that purple circle erupt from your troops, meaning more death for the enemy. The Murderous Prowess buff, or Murderous Mastery if you're an elite unit, will buff your unit stats to make them do even more damage. There's various different things that apply to various different units. So what's the key to this? It's making the most of all that damage, which is quite simply done by not wasting it. Make sure you've got all your melee units fighting somebody so they can take advantage of the extra melee attack. Make sure all your missiles are firing at somebody so they can take advantage of the armor piercing. Try to get your cavalries charging so they can take advantage of the charge bonus, etc. If you've got 3 units of Black Ark Corsairs stood there doing nothing while you've just popped their Murderous Prowess, that's a massive waste. So keep an eye on the Murderous Prowess bar and try to time it so that your units are engaged when they need to be. And it's definitely worth knowing, if you didn't already, that the Murderous Prowess bar is filled not only by the deaths of your enemies, but also by the deaths of your own troops. Make sure it's filled more by your enemies' deaths than yours, or you may find you don't have many people left to make use of Murderous Prowess. And as mentioned earlier, it's worth trying to run down routed units for those easy kills to rack up that bar faster. Dark Riders are great at this because they're so fast, but fast infantry like Witch Elves can do this too. Armor piercing is another strength of the Dark Elves, mainly in their missile units. They don't have a great deal of melee infantry that has armor piercing, but they have a hell of a lot of missiles. Dark Shards, Shades, repeater crossbows, Dreadlord with a crossbow. All these units can help support your main army, your melee infantry, your flanking infantry, to do some damage, soften the enemy up for them, or to help provide a distraction to allow them to get closer unharmed. And of course, all this armor piercing makes life easier when facing those heavily armored factions like Dwarves or Chaos, whoever. But do be aware of how much armor piercing you need, as different factions require different amounts. As your melee infantry and cavalry don't have a lot of armor piercing, the cheaper units, at least for the Dark Elves, don't have a lot of armor piercing. You'll need to make up for that with those missile units, and you've got plenty of options to choose from. Another strong area for the Dark Elves is in their offensive magic. They've got plenty to choose from. Malekith has all the best stuff: Chill Wind, Blade Wind, Soul Stealer. Lots of great choices to help support your army. There's some supporting buffs in there to buff your troops or debuff the enemies. Nothing in the way of healing really, just a lot of stuff to absolutely murder your enemy with, which is how the Dark Elves roll. Like any faction, try to apply your spells to defeat your biggest threats. Ambushing can be another great tactic for the Dark Elves with your Shades. They can move up with Stalk obviously and surprise the enemy, giving them a threat they can't ignore. Dark Riders can hide pretty well behind the brows of hills and trees. They have Vanguard deployment like the Shades do, so they can get in a nice sneaky position and plan for that surprise attack. Another great way to provide a distraction to protect those more important units. And lastly, one thing that can be the downfall of the Dark Elves is because they're so expensive, their armies are smaller, so be wary of numbers. You may get overrun by Greenskins, Skaven, Beastmen. If you are facing these factions, you may want to come with more quantity over quality, more Bleak Swords, more Dread Spears, something to stop the enemy from flanking around behind you so easily and just absolutely enveloping and overwhelming you. So all this I believe to be the main points about the Dark Elves army. Take them and use them as you will. You don't have to play this way by any means. You can experiment and get crazy with it. I would say that the Dark Elves are one of the more well-rounded factions of Warhammer 2, so this makes them a little bit more accessible and easier to play in some respects, so there is kind of a lot of freedom to try things out within their roster. And to aid you to that end of experimentation, we enter the build section. This is where I'll show you a few different army compositions that you could bring into battle. There'll be 3 different builds, one from me, one from Ninja Hunt, who we had a build from before, and new to this one, Indie Pride of Milk and Cookies Total War will be providing a build too. Check out links in the description for their channels if you wish to find out more. So first off, my build is pretty straightforward and a pretty balanced army. I'm going to move up with my main force, which is a front line of Bleak Swords, and I've got 3 units of cavalry on the edge to tie up whatever they have on the flanks. In the gap that should be created, I'm going to sneak through 2 units of Black Ark Corsairs to get on the flank. I've also got 2 units of Witch Elves, but I'm actually going to mix these in with my front line to support them with the Madness of Cain ability. I've also got 2 units of Dark Shards there, and on my right flank 2 units of Repeater Crossbows, who are currently playing with a Manticore. But their job will be distraction. I'm going to move up with my front line and engage the enemy's front line, sending in the Witch Elves now, making sure they don't absorb any charges. My cavalry has tied up all the enemy cavalry on the left side and should defeat them because we outnumber them. And my Black Ark Corsairs are free to move through this gap and get into the back of the enemy front line. They are taking some fire from the missiles, so I'm going to send in my Repeater Crossbow Cav just to get these units moving, maybe charge into them, do a little bit of damage, until something better can get after these skirmishers to sort them out. Black Ark Corsairs just about to reach the back of the enemy front line, get those leadership penalties, plenty of damage on the go. We're going to start dropping some spells as well, as there are some nice opportunities with all these clumped up troops. Blade Wind about to pop off over here. That is a very dangerous spell. It goes nicely through these units as well. doesn't go through my unit too much. Get 2 units of them wavering. Nice application of that spell there, I think. And I'm tying up the missiles now with the cav and the spears, and everyone is in position to absolutely murder everyone. We've got this timed quite nicely as well for Murderous Prowess, as it's just about to go off. So I protected my flanking units there. It was only a small flanking force, but those repeater crossbows were a flanking force as well, but they didn't have anything to stop them. They had that Manticore, but they took care of him pretty easily with their armor piercing damage. And then Murderous Prowess goes off, and that's pretty much going to be all she wrote for this Empire army. You can see some of the units there have gone into Rampage. Madness of Cain from the Witch Elves has taken over them, and this is just going to be an absolute slaughter of the Empire, and they're going to rout pretty damn quick. So that's my build, a pretty balanced one. Attack from the left with your cavalry, tie up whatever's there, sneak round, sneak through the gap with your Black Ark Corsairs. A fairly simple, straightforward plan, nothing too fancy. Now to Ninja Hun's build, which is a very long, straight front line, as he likes to do. Lots of bleak swords with 2 units of Blackguard of Nagarond in the middle, as well as 2 units of the anti-large cold ones on the flanks, and 4 units of repeater crossbows up front. He's Vanguard deployed these, which can work against the Chaos because they have no range. He's firing at the Trolls because this build is primarily anti-large. He's got the Blackguard, he's got the Cold One anti-large cav, and he's got these 4 units of armor-piercing cavalry, which will be very hard to catch and can do a lot of damage. On the flanks, he's going to tie up enemy cavalries using the help of his Lord there, and these anti-large Cold Ones should have no problem against other types of cavalry unless they're anti-large themselves, as that anti-large bonus will give them the advantage. Once he's got those flanks secured with that cavalry out the way, he should have an easy time flanking round. The enemy's engaging now, foolishly bringing his trolls into combat with the Blackguard of Nagarond, which is literally the worst choice in the world, as well as having Sartherial around there as well, and the frontline melee will engage. A lot of his troops are tied up fighting these Blackguard and things, so some of these bleak swords are free to come around the sides. The cavalry on the flanks has comfortably won their fights, so they can now flank around the back of the enemy front line and absolutely hammer them in the back. This is going to lead to some crushing leadership penalties for the Chaos, which is going to get rid of them pretty quick, despite not having a lot of armor piercing on that front line. The repeater crossbows were able to keep a lot of armor piercing pressure on the enemy, while the cold ones came around the back and just destroyed anything that was left. Just another example of another kind of build with a different kind of game plan. Onto Indie Pride's build, and it's quite different again. His build is focused around shades and their ranged power, making use of the crossbow dreadlord's ability to buff their armor piercing damage. Now while he has come with his own game plan for these shades, it's actually a bit of a struggle for him because the enemy has a similar army setup with a lot of ranged units. He's also making good use of shadow magic here to beat down these Swordmasters of Hoeth. He's taking cover in the trees until he can close the distance gap between the skirmishers. He's going to try and win that skirmish fight with some focus firing, but he does have to watch out for these Dragon Knights who he's had a bit of a tangle with already. He's also brought some Blackguard of Nagarond along, given the possibility of strong cavalry and dragons, both of which the enemy has brought. Eventually, he's going to force the High Elves to retreat to fall back to a better position more favourable to them. But Indy's still in no hurry to rush in with his melee troops. He wants to get rid of these missiles first. And with the Guiding Eye ability from the Dreadlord on the Shades, they're going to get the better of these archers once again. Once he gets rid of these archers, he knows all he has to do is deal with these Swordmasters of Hoeth, and they're pretty much half dead anyway. Then it'll just be a case of finishing off those Dragon Knights. He's going to start playing with the range a bit though, as the Loth and Seaguard start getting involved and there's probably too many missiles for his Shades to handle. He's going to fall back and try to play with the range of the High Elves. He's going to fall back outside the cone of range of those High Elf archers, and then when they're on the move to chase after him, he's going to move back in, which will close some of the distance, and those High Elf archers won't be firing because they'll be on the move, thus wasting some of their own range, allowing the Shades to start firing before they do. This battle is a proper back and forth skirmish between missile units, one that Indy probably didn't plan for, but given that his opponent brought very similar units, he had to adjust his plan to make it work. Eventually, it'll be time for the melee units to engage and try and finish off the rest of the army. I think this battle is a good illustration of Total War Online at least, as it shows no matter what build you have and what game plan you come with, you may be forced to change it up depending on what the enemy has brought. No build is going to work against every single other enemy build. Hopefully from this build section you can see the idea of making a build around a game plan, trying to implement that, but understanding that you may need to adjust your game plan if things don't necessarily go the way you expect. If you care to see how this battle turns out, you can check it out on Indie Pride's channel, linked in the description. And with this, we shall conclude this here Dark Elf army guide. I hope you found this useful, I hope you've learned something new, I hope you've gained a better understanding of the Dark Elves in battle. Yes, I will be doing the other factions before anyone asks, so thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the future.